I guess this is for Lowell or for Charles or anyone. I don't want to appear to be too cynical, but it seems to me clear that the cost of getting elected adds a lot to this kind of corruption. And I guess my question would be, how could you figure out whether or not the Obama administration, for example, is protecting corporations because they see it as a source of funds, and how much was the deal made before the election? And how would you figure that out?
Shall I first assemble questions?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Couple
More questions, please.
Should
Try
we
to
start
get them
talking
all.
or waiting, or we want to wait?
They want to wait. They stack.
Thank you. My name's Peter Bale, and I'm going to be joining the Centre for Public Integrity. First, could I say, Kadir, your stuff about global warming or climate change showed me a new way that investigative journalism can work pictorially, and I think that's incredibly powerful. But can I ask you, and maybe Chuck, because you, well, I'm going to be talking to you a lot anyway in the future, but how do we overcome public fatigue about so many of these stories? I mean, Nikki Hager wrote extraordinary pieces before the New Zealand election, which should have influenced that election, but did not, for example. There's a lot of fatigue amongst the public about these questions that you're raising. Is it just pointless work that makes us feel good, or what's the missing bit in getting action and reaction to some of this?
On a similar theme, Lau, you mentioned that the prosecutors are not necessarily allies to what we're doing as they were in the past. Who else should we be looking to? What are the alternatives we have now?
Can you handle one more?
No, I think let them get a chance to do this one. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Which wants to speak to the
Obama and money?
Yeah, you want to do it?
You're
I'm a money guy. Yeah.
I want to do one little positive thing I was going to try to say before we go further. I think there's more money being spent on investigative reporting right now, at least in the United States, through nonprofits like ProPublica or the Center for Investigative Reporting and the Center for Public Integrity. Just those three together is at least, if my math is correct, well over $30 million bucks.
Yeah.
And maybe 35 or 40 million. So remember that a lot of the legacy news organizations that no longer are around, the newspapers that have folded and so on, they weren't very good. And they weren't doing a lot of investigative reporting. Remember that today, Reuters, Bloomberg, Associated Press, most of the television networks, at least in the US, NBC just hired 18 people. They're all investing at least what they call investigative reporting, because the internet now makes instant news available everywhere. What makes them different is in-depth news of some kind. So there is still there's a growing appetite, at least in the U.S., and a growing amount of money being spent. And I think that's really extraordinary.
It's extraordinary.
Now we get to the bigger numbers.
And
with
it's
Obama.
historic,
It's
actually. What he just said has never happened in U.S. history, and we don't know where that's going exactly, but we're not unhappy about it at the moment. On the Obama banks subject, there have been some reporters attempting to get close to this. Gretchen Morgenson, I think, has done some nice work. There's no secret that the Obama administration raised millions of dollars from the Wall Street folks, and it's no secret that not a single CEO has been prosecuted. That fact by itself has been not widely, but somewhat heavily noted. The problem is, back to the anal retentive problem I mentioned, what's needed here is to do a little, there have been allusions to the SNL crisis. I think I did the first SNL story on 60 Minutes, possibly back in the mid-'80s. The worst financial crisis in America after the Depression was that 80s crisis. Most of the press missed that story, which is one of the reasons I started the center, because it bothered me what was happening or not happening in Washington. Supposedly, it's been written by Morgenson and others that there were more prosecutions by the Reagan administration of financial institutions. Now, part of that is because they were a lot of Democrats. They were in the southwest part of the U.S. I mean, I don't know, I don't accept that at face value, but what I'm getting at is there is some evidence that what has happened here with Obama is extremely notable. It requires going through all the banks in America and all their contributions and then tracking that directly. My investigative reporting workshop was the first and only people to put up 8,000 bank records for every bank in America called Bank Tracker from Federal Records, and also to put savings and loan, thrifts, I guess, the other little smaller banks, I'm blanking on the name, sorry. And we put all that up, and we were asked by the banks, don't publish this, or it'll create a run on the banks. It was a few months after the meltdown, and the New York Times was afraid to do it. The public editor said, we're afraid there'll be a run on the banks. We knew that a paper in Florida had done it, and we also knew that the person who wanted to do it, who was working with me, had already done it 10 or 20 years earlier in small print, so we put it up there, and we ignored the threat by the banks, and there was no problem. What is needed is a systematic investigation looking at the money, the contributions, but also the coziness. And a lot of the former bank officials went into the administration in addition. So that is a story where everyone kind of suspects it, but no one's documented.
This goes beyond the banking situation because, for example, I've been focused for at least 5 or 6 years now on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which has to do with overseas bribery. The Bush years, ironically, I suppose, I didn't expect it, the head of the criminal division tripled the size of the prosecution force on Foreign Corrupt Practices Act cases, and they jailed the CEO of Kellogg Brown and Root for bribing the Nigerian government over a 10-year period. And he went to prison. No parallel prosecution has taken place in the 7 years of the Obama administration. They have indicted middle and low-level officials of various companies, but nobody at higher ranks, and nobody's gone to jail yet.
What about the fatigue question?
Oh, the fatigue, well, you know, environmental stories just in general are amongst the hardest stories to sell to your bosses, the New York Times, or...
Well, it is hard, but at the same time, I think it has to be of interest of everyone. I mean, and I hope the story resonates in this room a little bit, but I mean, we're heading into an incredible human disaster, which maybe we will not experience in our lives. But I mean, we are sitting in London here, and in New York, and in Boston, and in Miami. So as I said, not just far away. So I think it was 3 years ago when I started, and I was talking to editors and colleagues. Everybody was like, that's not a very good idea. But I think, you know, I mean, like Sandy and other events, recent events, natural disasters, or if you want to call them natural disasters, help to bring some attention to it. And, you know, I mean, yeah, it's around the corner, and it's happening here as well. I mean, you're not safe in London either. And
there is more coverage.
Live on a boat.
Good. ProPublica found that 1/6 of the land mass of Louisiana has disappeared into the ocean. There's starting to be coverage, but not enough. I totally agree. And journalists have been very cautious up until now, and they're starting to shed some of that caution that, hey folks, there might be a little problem here. Start acknowledging it. The so-called mainstream media has been extremely reticent.
And the problem is that if you look at the US East Coast, if you see where the GDP actually comes from, how many people live on the East Coast, it's just staggering.
Right.
But the question is also about
fatigue. You know.
We write more and more stories to show pictures. Seeing is believing is a very different way of communicating.
That will help with the fatigue factor. I think the pictures that we saw, the video is so astonishing. It was magnificent. When's this running, by the way?
Well, it ran in the New York Times.
Oh, it already ran. Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
And then I I
still,
thought I closed it.
I would say it's still, today's paper is generally about the price of oil is going down.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Consumption will be going up as a result. Profits are down for the energy industry, but everyone else is prospering. That was the opinion column in the New York Times. So, you know, there have been attempts to tell the story many times. Unfortunately, I don't think you're going to see the kind of economic reorganization that you need to deal with it until possibly it's too late.
Yeah, up there.
Hello, my name's Peter Jukes. I've done a lot of work on the phone hacking scandal and police bribes related to News Corp in the UK. So I have a specific question for Lowell about his great documentary on this and what's happening with that and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in relation to that.
Fine.
But and a slightly more general one is that you've addressed corporate power. This is the same for all three of you. What happens when corporate power is more and more focused on information technology and media? I mean, the problems, if you like, of monopoly in the UK and Australia, at least, of News Corp, is replicated many times over with information giants like Google or Facebook or Yahoo. So just a specific question, SVPA, and a more general one about media monopolies.
Oh, by the way, it just made me think that when Chuck was talking about the tobacco industry, remember, the Chinese and Japanese governments sell tobacco. So it's it's like vodka in Russia. So it's the government selling you something that'll kill you. The FCPA, the foreign bribery thing with Murdoch, and if I may call News Corporation Murdoch, I guess I can, is a kind of interesting situation because I think I wrote the first thing that started sort of the coverage that said that if the News Corporation as its policy was bribing police, and it's a U.S. company, that's a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes it illegal to bribe public officials in another country. And the interpretation of it related to bribing a police department, I think is kind of unique. My understanding is that the FBI and the Justice Department is watching these last two trials that are going on currently very carefully to see what the adjudication is, because these involve reporters directly bribing and paying the police, and what they'll do. But so far in the history of the Holder Justice Department, it's about to change leadership, that could probably result in a fine of some kind to the corporation, and unlikely that anybody will be charged criminally. Now, they could change, if it was the Bush administration, I know it sounds funny, but if it was Attorney General Gonzalez and Alice Fisher running the criminal division, there would be criminal indictments of individuals. But for whatever reason, Holder and the Justice Department, well, there's a long story as to how they did this. It's not, by the way, it doesn't show up when I was making these remarks as like money for favors. It has to do with the kind of institutional atmosphere in the department, which is what you hear from people. They're no longer aggressive. They're very cautious. They've instituted extra levels of bureaucracy. They don't want to be embarrassed. So they operate in a different way. Now, I don't know if that's the influence of campaign contributions or just their view that these cases aren't worth doing.
Last question?
Yeah.
Mr. Lovell, I'd like to ask, but also Mr. Lewis, I'd like to ask, just now you mentioned that, the kind of economic reorganization that we might need for climate change might come too late. And since Mr. Lewis has been working on these kind of stories and reported that, we always get things last, what is your conception of too late? And are you optimistic that whenever it comes out, at least it came out? Or do you think that there's a time in which it should have come out, and if not, it feels like a failure?
Are we already too late?
Well, that's why we have a bar at the end of the day. No, I'm just kidding. It can be different. I think we're in a freeze-dried, 140-character world now, where something that happened yesterday. What was that again? Yesterday? Oh yeah, yesterday. And so everything is faster now, and the attention span of the public, which may have already rivaled that of a hummingbird before all the new media forms. I mean, I actually think we have a very serious problem of just paying attention in general. And the fatigue question earlier blends into this, because I do think people have substantially tuned out the sports infatuation in America and other countries, and obviously soccer here, football. These are all ways to avoid even thinking about this stuff. But to the question about information, I think the inspiring thing about this conference is the examples of raw information, data government records actually coming out from concerned citizens inside the government or folks knowing about things and finding it and releasing it. And that is in real time, pretty close to real time. Things like that, where the public's getting mad and angry, not going to take it anymore, and starting to rise up, not just journalists, around journalists. And I'm also interested in academics, all the brilliant academics who have great data. We're about to do a project, a global project with a public anthropologist regarding the U.S. military activities around the world that no one's reported on. And so I think it's actually an exciting time, but the real-time thing really bothers the hell out of me, which you may have noticed. And that's a challenge, because investigative reporting takes time and it costs money, and how do you beat that time issue? It's got to happen quicker.
Well, you know, the environmental reporting, you think of whom first? Rachel Carlson, right? Not a major mainstream media, a freelancer doing a book. This kind of work normally, traditionally, has been done by freelancers, writers of books, magazines, and so on. And then there was coverage in the New Yorker. But the thing that really turned the tide, at least in the U.S., in the 1960s, was the actual conditions people were living under, whether it was in Los Angeles, where you couldn't see the mountains every day, to New York Harbor, which you couldn't swim in. So eventually, by 1970, you had Earth Day, and you had Nixon creating the EPA. So because the public became involved, and it became an actual quality of life question. So far, global warming hasn't had that kind of direct quality of life, except for an emergency like Hurricane Sandy.
Powerful financial interests don't want it to happen. That's not unrelated to what we're discussing.
No, you don't smell it.
Yeah.
Right.
Or you
So
can't
it's
fight,
only
It's
happening
an
when
island
it's...
in the middle of the Pacific, or maybe Miami Beach, but
Well, and obviously, as we all know, I mean, the consequences for the people on those islands, they're not definitely not the polluters. Even the footprint of Bangladesh is very low compared to the U.S. and China and Europe.
I'd like to ask a question myself. One of the curious observations one makes from being so far away from the States in Britain is how quiet the investigative community has been on a number of key questions that are unusual, primarily because they've been sort of front page news over here and around the rest of the world. This one dead, yeah. One of the things that was odd, we've been connected, some of us, with the Assange revelations and the Snowden revelations. And these have had a curiously limited circulation in the States. And given its front page prominence today in Brazil, in Argentina, in India, Pakistan, in most countries, this is a huge issue. And hasn't been quite that same issue, probably because the New York Times has published almost nothing of it. And the Washington Post has published sort of like 1/20th of it. But the question is, the investigative organizations like IRE and some of the others have never touched it. They've hardly ever mentioned it. I've always thought it's astonishing that given the severity of this stuff, that nobody is ever talking about it. Perhaps either of you would love to comment on this.
He can't wait.
No. I gave never mind. First of all, there's an interesting part of the revelations and the choice by whoever in the handling of the Snowden information was initially to cut the New York Times out, right? So there was clearly some institutional bad feeling there, and that had to do with the treatment by Bill Keller of Julian Assange, right? Directly. So one of the problems in the media business is that many of us, I'll include myself, have egos, and are very egotistical, and we want the story first, or we want to control the story, and editors especially get enamored of that, and so you're seeing some of that. But I would say that what's really in the long term amazed me is the use to which Chelsea Manning's information has been, the use to me, just as a reporter, of that information And the number of times that you see WikiLeaks or Wiki documents or things like that in various people's stories. That's the first part. The Snowden, I'd have to, and by the way, 60 Minutes did a very, I thought, even-handed job with Julian Assange, and two-segment thing. And then recently, Brian Williams at NBC did the equivalent of a network hour, which is 42 minutes. The rest is all commercials. But they did that with Snowden. And it was I thought, a very even-handed interview, and
But
probably the best thing that's come out so far.
Well, they were as personality profiles. I think what actually happened was a very delicate portrait of them as human beings came out, but the actual substance of the revelations, hardly a word. Very, very little.
You know, when I've come to Europe, I noticed the dichotomy, not just in England, but other countries here in the area. They view the U.S., and I share the vision of this. There is an obsequious nature by the leading news organizations. There is a deference to power when it comes to national security. You know, bureau chiefs of certain elite papers that are based in New York, gosh, I wonder who that could be, will run a story by folks across the river before it's published. And there has always been a reticence. The extent of spiked stories at the times during the Iraq War has not fully been told still. There are other stories that, including one involving Jim Risen, by the way, that has never been told. So I do think there is a different attitude about when you're a national security state that you've built up since the nuclear age, and you've got nearly 1,000 bases on planet Earth, and the world is your playground, and Dick Cheney sends out holiday cards comparing the U.S. to Rome. There is not a great interest in investigating this subject by the media. That's my view.
Let me play devil's advocate here. The United States is the only country that I know of in the world where you can publish national security secrets in the newspaper and not get arrested, or have your hard drive destroyed or your computer destroyed. As in Britain, when the Guardian can publish information from Snowden about the United States, but it cannot publish about GCHQ. Der Spiegel can publish very detailed article I was surprised with, names and addresses and all kinds of detailed information that the average reader doesn't need in Der Spiegel about NSA operations in the United States.
And in Germany.
Also about the BND under Der Spiegel.
Right.
We can do it.
You can do it. Okay. So that's one of the few places you can. You can't do it in France, you can't do it in Canada, you definitely can't do it in Russia, and you can't do it in China. So the United States is the first country where you could do that. And actually Cy, who was here, when he was first publishing, one of the questions was he going to go to jail? So the precedents were, the prior restraint of that kind of publication in the U.S. disappeared with the Pentagon Papers case. But then but the Supreme Court said in that decision, if someone publishes, we can't stop them from publishing, but if they publish, they can be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. That hasn't happened yet in the U.S.
And there are many countries where investigative journalists take a lot of risks to get in prison, not only in the States, but in many countries around the world, of course. This brings us to the end of the session. We are running really late, so it's going like this. No, we will catch up, no problem. We take half an hour break. 4:30 we start with Tools for Survival, and then we go immediately on to the interview with Assange. Yeah? So we skip the break at 5.